I have always loved hiking. I never cared much for crowds, so when I had free time, I would usually head out into places that weren't packed with people. I liked the quiet. I liked hearing my own footsteps crunch against dirt and rock, the wind moving through the trees, and the sound of streams running over stones. It felt clean compared to the busy, noisy life back in town. That was the reason I decided to take a solo trip in the middle of late summer, heading out into an area of backcountry I had read about in a trail guide. It was supposed to be challenging but not dangerous if you were prepared. The area was about 2 hours away from where I lived, a mix of thick forest, old logging roads, narrow trails, and some higher ridges that gave you views of the valleys below. I had packed all the things I thought I might need: a good backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, food, plenty of water, a filter pump, a first aid kit, a lighter, and a map with a compass. I had also charged my phone and carried a power bank, even though the guide warned that cell service was poor out there. I figured I would be fine. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, and this would just be another trip to push myself a little harder. The morning I started, the air was already warm. I parked at the trailhead, signed into the little logbook that rangers left for hikers, and started walking. The first few miles were calm and easy. The trail went through tall trees, the kind that blocked most of the sunlight, so the ground was damp even though there hadn't been rain for weeks. Birds called from high branches, and every now and then a squirrel darted across the path. My pack felt heavy at first, but after a while my body adjusted, and I settled into a rhythm. The plan was to follow the main trail up to a ridge, then cut down toward a lake that was marked on the map. The guide had said the lake was quiet, not visited often, and a good spot for camping. That was what I wanted, a place away from anyone else, just me, the water, and the woods. I had planned to stay out there for 3 nights before hiking back. By midday, I had reached a section where the trail split. One way followed the ridge, the other sloped down into a valley. I checked the map and compass, and it looked clear that I needed to stay on the ridge trail. The valley led toward old logging roads that eventually petered out into nowhere. I ate some food sitting on a fallen tree, then got moving again. As I climbed higher, the air grew hotter. Sweat soaked through my shirt and ran down my back, making the pack straps rub against my skin. The trail became rougher, with rocks and roots sticking up. I stumbled a few times but kept going. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge. The trees thinned out and I could finally see far in every direction. Rolling green hills, dark patches of forest, and a shimmer of water in the distance that had to be the lake. Felt good to spot it. I figured I could reach it in a couple of hours if I kept up my pace. The descent was harder than I thought. The slope was steep, and the trail twisted down through thick brush. I had to push branches aside, and more than once I slipped on loose dirt. The map showed a clear path, but on the ground it didn't look so clear. Sections seemed washed out. In other spots, game trails crisscrossed, and I had to stop often to check the compass. The sun had dipped lower, shadows stretching across the forest floor. I realized that if I didn't reach the lake before dark, I would have to set up camp somewhere along the way. After nearly an hour, the trail vanished into a tangle of undergrowth. I stopped, confused. According to the map, I should have been on the right track, but all I saw ahead was brush. I checked behind me and saw no obvious fork I might have missed. The light was fading fast, the air cooling, and the forest around me growing quiet. A kind of uneasy feeling crept over me. I pulled out the map again, crouched down and studied it. I must have veered slightly off course when the trail got rough. The compass needle pointed north, but it didn't line up with where I thought I should be. I decided to push through the brush, figuring I would reconnect with the trail a little further down. That was a mistake. The brush got thicker, grabbing at my legs, snagging my pack. Branches slapped against my face, leaving scratches. After 20 minutes of fighting through it, I came out into a small clearing. The lake wasn't there. Instead, I stood in front of more forest stretching downhill. By now, the sky above the trees was dark orange. I had maybe an hour of usable light left. My chest felt tight with worry. I had 2 choices: turn around and try to backtrack, or keep pushing downhill in the hope of finding the lake. The problem was, once I looked behind me, The path I had forced through the brush already looked swallowed back up. Everything blended together. Backtracking would not be simple. I decided to go downhill. Water usually pooled in valleys, and since I had seen the lake earlier from the ridge, I believed I was at least heading in the right direction. As I moved lower, the slope became rougher. My boots slid on loose soil, and once I stumbled hard enough to fall onto my hands, scraping them against sharp rocks. I pushed myself back up, brushed off the dirt, and kept going. The woods grew denser, darker. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself I had gear, food, and water. I could set up camp anywhere if I had to, but deep down I knew being off trail was bad, very bad. When the light was nearly gone, I reached a stream trickling between rocks. Relief washed over me. Streams often led to lakes, and I guessed this one might. I decided to follow it. I walked along its bank for maybe half an hour, but the darkness closed in so much that I couldn't see my footing clearly. I knew I had to stop. I found a flat spot a little above the stream and set down my pack. My hands shook as I unrolled the tent and sleeping bag. The forest at night pressed in close, every sound amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I forced myself to eat something, though I wasn't hungry, and crawled into the tent. I lay there in the pitch dark, listening, wide awake. That night felt endless. Every time I closed my eyes, some sound outside made me snap them open. At one point, I heard heavy movement, like something larger than a deer. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I gripped the knife I kept near me, waiting, barely breathing. Eventually, the sound faded. When the first gray light came through the fabric of the tent, I wasted no time. I packed up and went straight back to the stream. My plan was simple: follow it until it led me somewhere. Lakes, rivers, or even roads. Water was life, and I had at least that as a guide. The day wore on, and the forest seemed endless. The stream twisted, sometimes vanishing underground, sometimes widening. I followed every turn. My legs ached, and blisters formed on my feet. Hours passed with no sign of the lake. Worse, the sun seemed hotter than the day before, and I felt drained quickly. I refilled my bottle using the filter, but the water tasted metallic and made me uneasy. By afternoon, my hopes started to crack. The map no longer made sense. Nothing matched. My compass worked, but without knowing exactly where I was, the directions meant little. I tried to climb a slope to get a view, but all I saw were more endless ridges and trees. No signs of people, no trails, nothing. That second night, I camped again near the stream. My food supply was fine, but my body was tired. My skin felt raw from scratches, and my shoulders ached from the pack. Lying in the tent, I realized how fragile I was out there. The forest didn't care about me. It stretched on, silent and indifferent. The third day was worse. My legs moved slower. I kept stumbling. At one point, I slipped on moss and fell hard into the stream, soaking myself completely. My pack grew heavy with water. I pulled it off, wrung out my clothes, and sat there shivering even though the air was warm. The stream finally opened into a marshy area with tall grass. I pushed through, hoping it might lead to the lake, but the ground turned soft, sucking at my boots, slowing me to a crawl. The grass rose above my head, blocking all sight lines. The buzzing of insects swarmed my ears. Panic hit me hard. I turned around, forcing myself back to solid ground. By evening, I had to accept the truth. I was lost. Not just a little turned around, completely lost. My best chance now was not to wander endlessly, but to think carefully. I decided I would try to climb the ridge again the next day and mark my position as best as I could. That night, lying in the tent, I barely slept at all. My stomach cramped from eating too little, my throat dry even though I drank water. My thoughts spun in circles. What if nobody came looking for me? I had signed into the trailhead log, but who knew when someone would notice I hadn't returned? Maybe not for days. On the fourth morning, I left the stream and tried to climb. The slope was brutal, covered in loose stone and brush. My pack felt twice as heavy. I stopped often, panting, sweat dripping into my eyes. At the top, I hoped for a clear view, Instead, I had been hiking for years, but this trip was supposed to be different. I wanted to push myself further than I normally did, so I picked a trail that was less traveled. It was deep in the mountains, a place I had only read about in a few online trip reports. Most people avoided it because the path wasn't well maintained, and the ridges could be dangerous in bad weather. That was exactly what attracted me. I thought I was ready for it. The morning I set out, the air was cool, and the sky was pale blue with streaks of light clouds. I parked my car at the small dirt pullout where the trailhead started. There were no other cars, which I noticed right away. That meant I'd probably be alone the whole time. I should have thought harder about what that really meant, but instead, I felt excited. Being alone in the woods always gave me a strange mix of fear and calm. I strapped on my pack, checked my water, and started up the trail. The first section wound through thick pine forest. The trees were close together, their branches heavy with needles, and the ground was covered in old brown needles that muffled my steps. It felt like walking on a soft carpet. Every now and then, I heard a bird call or the quick rustle of something small moving in the underbrush. Other than that, it was quiet. The trail climbed slowly at first. I passed a small stream where the water trickled over mossy rocks. I bent down to splash some on my face, and the coldness shocked me awake. The air smelled like pine sap and damp earth. Everything around me felt alive, but also heavy, like the forest was pressing in on me from all sides. After about an hour, the trail got steeper. The trees thinned out a little, and the sun started breaking through in patches. I stopped to drink water and look back down the slope. From where I stood, I could see the tops of the trees stretching far out, a sea of green. There was no sign of roads or buildings, just forest in every direction. That was the first time I felt a little nervous. Being that deep in the woods meant that if anything happened, I was on my own. I pushed on. The trail became rocky, and I had to watch my step. Loose stones slid under my boots, and I had to grab onto roots and low branches to steady myself. My shirt stuck to my back with sweat, even though the air was still cool. I kept thinking about the reports I had read. People mentioned that once you reached the ridge, the path was faint and easy to lose. They had warned that fog sometimes rolled in fast, and hikers had gotten turned around up there. By midday, I reached the ridge. It was a narrow strip of land with steep drops on both sides. The view should have been beautiful, but the sky had started to change. Clouds were gathering, moving fast over the peaks. The air grew heavier, and a faint wind whistled through the rocks. I stood there catching my breath and noticed how exposed I suddenly felt. On both sides, the land dropped down so far that I couldn't see the bottom through the trees. The trail across the ridge wasn't clear. There were faint footprints in the dirt, but they split in different directions. I tried to follow the most worn path, but after a few minutes, it faded into patches of grass and loose stone. I stopped and checked my map. The line on the paper looked simple, but on the ground, nothing matched. I looked up, and that was when I noticed how quickly the fog was moving in. It came from the west, thick and low, swallowing the trees as it rolled over them. Within minutes, the view around me started to vanish. The ridge that had stretched out clearly before was now a wall of white. I could see only a few yards ahead. The air grew damp and cold. I pulled my jacket from my pack and put it on, but the chill still crept into me. I told myself to stay calm. I had been in fog before, but never this thick. I kept moving slowly, trying to follow the faint path. My boots slipped on wet rock, and the fog made everything look the same. Trees, rocks, grass, all of it blurred together. I checked my compass and tried to keep heading in the right direction, but the ridge twisted and narrowed, and I couldn't be sure if I was drifting off course. After another hour, the trail disappeared completely. I stood on a slope of loose stones with nothing but white around me. My map was useless without landmarks. I crouched down to steady myself and tried to think. Going back seemed just as hard as going forward. The fog was so thick that I couldn't even tell which way was back. I decided to keep moving carefully, hoping I'd stumble onto a clearer path. My heart was beating fast, and every step felt dangerous. The ground was unstable. Rocks shifted under me, sliding down the slope into the fog. I imagined falling and vanishing into that white void, no one ever finding me. At some point, I realized I was descending. The slope angled down more sharply, and I followed it, thinking maybe it would lead me back into the forest where I'd have some cover. The fog thinned slightly as I went lower, but the ground was uneven. My legs ached from bracing myself against slipping. My water was running low, and I hadn't eaten since morning. When the fog finally lifted a little, I saw that I was in a place I didn't recognize. The ridge was gone, and I was surrounded by tall pines again, but the forest looked different from before. The trees were darker, the ground was tangled with roots and underbrush, and the silence felt heavier. I tried to check my map again, but nothing matched. The streams, the ridges, the clearings, it all looked different in real life. I kept walking, trying to find something familiar, but everything blended together. Hours passed, and the light started to change. Evening was coming. The forest grew dim, shadows stretching longer between the trees. I realized then how serious things were. I had no idea where I was, and night was closing in. I picked a spot between some trees and decided I'd have to make camp. I cleared a small space, laid out my tarp, and tried to settle in. The ground was cold and uneven. The noises of the forest grew louder as darkness fell. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant calls of animals. My stomach cramped with hunger, but I forced down a granola bar and a little water. I told myself I'd figure things out in the morning. That night was long. Couldn't sleep. Every sound made me sit up and listen. I thought I heard footsteps at one point, slow and heavy, but when I held my breath and listened harder, the sound faded into silence. My heart pounded, and I gripped the small knife I always carried, though I knew it wouldn't help much. The cold sank into me, and by dawn, I was shivering and exhausted. The next day, I tried again to find the trail. I walked for hours, marking trees with my knife so I wouldn't circle back without realizing it. The forest felt endless. Sometimes I thought I heard running water, but when I followed the sound, it vanished. My throat was dry, and I knew I had to find a stream soon. Finally, I stumbled onto one. The water ran clear over rocks, and I knelt to drink. The coldness felt like fire in my chest, but it gave me strength. I filled my bottle and sat there for a while, staring at the water. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the muddy bank, there was a single boot print. It was old, half-washed by rain, but it was there. I wasn't the only one who had been here. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe the trail wasn't far. But then the thought hit me. If this person had also gotten lost, maybe they hadn't made it out. The idea of wandering in circles where others might have vanished made me feel small and helpless. The days blurred together after that. I rationed my food, ate handfuls of berries I was half sure were safe, and kept walking. My legs ached constantly, my shoulders burned from the pack, and my lips cracked from dryness. The silence of the forest started to feel oppressive. Sometimes I thought I saw movement between the trees, a flash of color, a shadow slipping away, but when I looked closer, there was nothing. On the fourth day, I woke up weak. My body felt heavy, and my head spun when I stood. I knew I couldn't last much longer without finding a way out. That morning, I decided to climb. I spotted a steep hill that rose above the trees, and I forced myself up it, grabbing roots and rocks to pull myself higher. My lungs burned, and sweat dripped into my eyes, but when I reached the top, the view almost broke me. Endless forest. That was all I saw. Green stretching in every direction, ridges and valleys folding into each other, with no sign of roads, buildings, or clearings. The fog clung to the distant ridges like ghosts, and I realized how far from help I really was. But then, as I scanned the horizon, I saw something. A thin line cutting through the trees far away. It looked straight, unnatural, like a road or maybe a power line cut. My chest filled with hope and fear all at once. It was miles away, but it was the first real sign of human presence I had seen in days. I climbed down and started toward it. The journey took the rest of the day. I stumbled, fell, got back up, and and pushed forward. When night fell, I was still far from it, but I kept going, using the moonlight to guide me. I could barely feel my legs anymore, but I always liked hiking alone. Some people find it boring or dangerous, but to me it gave a sense of control. When I went out by myself, I didn't have to adjust my pace for anyone. I could stop where I wanted, walk as long as I wanted, and carry only what I needed. For years, I had been taking day hikes around different trails, usually staying within marked routes that looped back toward the parking lots. I was confident in my navigation, but I had never pushed myself beyond trails that were well-traveled. That changed one summer when I decided to hike a canyon area a few hours from my home. The area wasn't completely unknown, but it wasn't one of those busy tourist spots either. The canyon stretched miles across desert terrain, with smaller gullies branching off the main gorge. The maps I studied online showed an official trail that followed the ridge for a while before dipping into the canyon floor. According to a few trip reports I read, some hikers like to go off-trail and explore side routes, but they warned about how easy it was to get disoriented in the branching gullies. I told myself I wouldn't take unnecessary risks. My plan was simple: start early, follow the main trail, go down into the canyon, explore for a few hours, and head back well before sunset. I packed light but careful. I had a day pack with a hydration bladder filled with 3 liters of water, a filter straw in case I needed to drink from a stream, some protein bars, jerky, a headlamp, a small first aid kit, a knife, sunscreen, and my phone with offline maps downloaded. I also had a compass and a paper topo map folded in a Ziploc bag, though I hadn't used one in years since I relied on GPS apps most of the time. I told myself it was just in case. I left home before sunrise and reached the trailhead by mid-morning. The lot had a few other cars parked, but not many. The air was already warming, dry and sharp in my nose. I signed the little trail register box, writing down my name, time, and intended route, then hoisted my pack and started along the trail. At first, it was easy walking. The trail wound over rocky soil dotted with desert plants, yucca, sagebrush, and low cacti. The sun climbed quickly, and soon heat shimmered rose over the ground. I could see the canyon ahead, a jagged cut slicing deep into the plateau. From above, it looked like a crack that swallowed the earth. After about an hour, the trail reached the rim. The view opened wide, showing the canyon walls layered in shades of red and brown, the floor hidden in shadow. The official trail ran along the rim for a stretch. Then a marked spur descended switchbacks into the gorge. I followed it down carefully, placing my boots against the sandy rock as the path zigzagged lower. The walls closed in, and the temperature dropped slightly, though the air felt heavier without the breeze. At the bottom, I reached a dry streambed scattered with round stones. According to my map, this was the main canyon floor, and the official trail continued along it for several miles before turning back up toward the rim. I checked my phone GPS. It matched the map, and continued forward, feeling good. For a while, everything was fine. The canyon floor was wide enough to follow without trouble, though sometimes the path wound around boulders or narrowed between high walls. There were faint footprints in the sandy patches, proof that other hikers had come through. I ate a snack bar and sipped water, feeling the weight of the sun above, though I couldn't see it directly. After maybe 2 hours, I came to a junction where another gully split off from the main canyon. It wasn't marked, but curiosity tugged at me. The side gully was narrower, with shade between its higher walls, and I thought it might be interesting to explore just for a short distance before turning back. I checked the offline map on my phone, but it didn't show much detail about that specific branch. I told myself I would only go a short way and keep track of my turns. The gully twisted and narrowed, the ground rougher with loose rocks. The walls rose higher until they blocked most of the sky, and my footsteps echoed faintly. I followed it longer than I meant to, each bend making me want to see what was around the next corner. After a while, I realized I had gone far. I stopped, looked back, and saw nothing but winding walls that all looked the same. That was when I pulled out my phone again. The GPS dot still showed me inside the canyon, but it was less clear than before. The satellite map was just lines of shading that didn't match the small twists of the gully. Still, I thought I knew the general direction back. I turned around and retraced my steps. At least I thought I did. The problem with canyons is how easily you can fool yourself. Every bend looks like the last. After 20 minutes of walking back, I didn't reach the junction where the gully met the main canyon. Instead, I came to another fork I didn't remember. One narrow chute split to the left, another to the right. Both looked similar. I felt a pinch of unease in my chest. I stopped and checked the compass, but inside the high walls the needle seemed unreliable, wavering toward different directions. I told myself not to panic. I picked one branch, trying to judge by the angle of the sunlight reaching down. I walked for a long time, expecting the main canyon to appear, but it never did. Instead, the walls closed tighter until I had to squeeze between them. My pack scraped against the stone. Eventually, the gully dead-ended at a tall dry fall, a vertical drop of smooth rock too steep to climb. I sighed and turned back. By now, the unease had grown into real anxiety. I had plenty of water left, but not enough to wander endlessly. I tried the other branch at the fork. That one twisted, then split again into two more chutes. I kept choosing, turning, backtracking. Each time I thought I was getting closer, I ended up more lost. The gullies branched like a maze, and the walls all looked the same dusty red. Hours slipped by. My legs grew tired from scrambling over rocks, and my throat grew dry despite sipping water. I stopped in a patch of shade to rest, my heart thudding. I studied the paper topo map, but it was nearly useless down here. The gullies were too small to be drawn on the map, so all I saw was blank space inside the canyon. My GPS dot drifted on the screen, sometimes jumping yards in random directions. The sun moved slowly across the strip of sky above, and I realized afternoon was passing. I needed to find the main canyon before dark, or at least find a wider space to spend the night safely. The idea of being trapped in these narrow walls after sunset filled me with dread. I forced myself to keep walking. I marked the ground with small piles of stones at forks, hoping to avoid circling the same routes. Once, I climbed partway up a sloping wall, scraping my hands just to see above. The view showed more gullies and cliffs stretching in every direction. No obvious main canyon visible. My stomach twisted as I slid back down. By evening, I had burned through most of my water. I still had half a liter, but my lips were cracked and my skin sticky with sweat. I thought about using the filter straw, but the ground was dry, no pools or trickles anywhere. I found a wider spot where the gully opened slightly, with a flat patch of sand. I decided I would have to stay there for the night. I ate some jerky, forcing myself to chew even though my mouth was dry. The air cooled as the sun dipped, shadows growing deep in the walls. Soon it was nearly dark. I put on my headlamp, the narrow beam bouncing against the stone. Every sound seemed louder, the scrape of pebbles, the faint sigh of wind. My nerves twitched at every noise, but it was just the canyon settling into night. I tried to sleep sitting against the wall, but my mind wouldn't rest. The darkness felt suffocating. The air cooled enough to chill my skin, but I didn't have a sleeping bag, only a light jacket. I shivered through the night, dozing in short bursts, jerking awake at every rustle. By dawn, my body ached, and my throat burned. I had maybe a quarter liter of water left. I knew I couldn't waste the day. I had to find the main canyon or at least climb to the rim. I picked a direction and started walking again, my legs stiff. The gullies wound endlessly. I climbed over boulders, scraped through narrow slots, and slid down loose slopes. Each turn looked like hope, but each ended in more stone. The heat grew with the morning sun. I drank the last of my water, knowing it wouldn't last long. After hours, I came to a wider chute with a slope of scree leading upward. It looked possible to climb, though dangerous. I decided it might be my only chance. I started up, using hands and feet, small rocks sliding under me. My arms trembled, but I forced myself higher. Halfway up, I slipped and scraped my forearm, blood smearing against the rock. I caught myself and breathed hard, then kept going. At last, I reached the rim of the chute. The view opened. I could see over the maze of gullies, and in the distance, far but visible, I saw the wider cut of the main canyon. Relief surged in my chest. It looked miles away, but at least I knew the direction. I marked the angle in my head and started working toward it, staying high on the slopes where I could. The sun burned overhead, and my throat was like sand. I moved slowly. I had planned the hike for weeks. It wasn't anything extreme compared to what professional hikers take on. But for me, it was the biggest one I had ever tried. The trail was long, steep in some places, and it was far from any town. I had studied the maps, checked the weather, packed everything carefully, and convinced myself I was ready. I wanted to test myself to see how far I could go and how I would handle being alone out there. The trail started at the base of a mountain range about 2 hours away from my home. When I pulled into the small gravel lot that morning, the sun was just starting to light up the trees. The air was cold, sharper than I expected, but it felt good. I slung my pack over my shoulders, tightened the straps, and started moving up the path that disappeared into the thick forest. At first, it was calm and quiet. The trees closed in on both sides, and the trail wound upward with roots and rocks sticking out. I took my time, knowing it would be a long day. I had food, water, a first aid kit, a small flashlight, an emergency blanket, and a knife. I told myself I had what I needed, even though the thought of something going wrong never really left the back of my mind. After about an hour, I found a rhythm. My boots crunched against the dirt, birds sang overhead, and every now and then, a breeze carried the scent of pine. It felt peaceful, like I had stepped into a different world where the usual noise of life didn't exist. But the further I went, the more the peace turned into something heavier. The forest grew darker, thicker. The sunlight barely broke through the tall trees, and I started noticing how quiet it got between gusts of wind. No voices, no cars, no signs of anyone else. Just me. That was when the first thought really hit me. If something went wrong, no one would know where I was. I shook it off, telling myself not to overthink it, but I tightened the straps on my pack and walked faster. The trail grew steeper. My thighs burned, sweat rolled down my back, and the weight of my pack pressed harder against me. I stopped every so often to drink water and look around. The trees all looked the same after a while. Brown trunks, green needles, patches of moss. If I had stepped off the path even a little, I knew it would be nearly impossible to find it again. After a couple more hours, I reached a section of switchbacks. The path zigzagged up the side of the slope, and the ground dropped steeply to one side. My legs ached, but the higher I got, the better the view became. Through breaks in the trees, I could see layers of ridges stretching out into the distance. I pushed hard until I finally reached a flat stretch near the top. My chest heaved, my shirt was damp, and I wanted nothing more than to sit down and catch my breath. I found a spot on a large rock and pulled out a snack. That's when I noticed it. The forest was too quiet. It wasn't just the usual stillness. It was heavy, unnatural. No bird calls, no insects buzzing, not even the wind. It was as if the whole mountain had gone silent at once. I froze with the food halfway to my mouth, scanning the trees. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the animals had moved deeper into the woods, or maybe it was just the time of day. But my gut told me something was wrong. I packed up quickly and started walking again, faster this time. The silence pressed down on me, and every crunch of my boots sounded too loud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The trail narrowed again as it cut across the slope. To my left, the mountain rose up in jagged rocks and dense trees. To my right, the ground dropped steeply into a valley. My eyes kept darting into the woods, looking for movement. That was when I heard it. A branch snapped. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My stomach twisted. I stopped dead, holding my breath, listening. Another sound followed, faint but clear. Something moving through the trees. I wanted to believe it was a deer, maybe even a bear keeping its distance. But the way it moved, slow, deliberate, didn't feel like an animal. It felt like footsteps. I forced myself to keep walking. My mouth was dry, my hands clenched around the straps of my pack, and my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself not to run, not to panic. The trail was still long, and if I wasted my energy too fast, I'd be in more trouble. Minutes dragged by. Every so often, I heard another sound. Leaves crunching, sticks breaking, something brushing against bark. Always behind me, never in front. I quickened my pace, but the sounds matched me. When I slowed, they slowed. When I sped up, they sped up. By the time I reached another clearing, sweat was pouring down my face, but this time it wasn't just from the hike. I spun around, scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing, just shadows and endless trees. I thought about shouting, but the idea of breaking the silence terrified me more. I decided to leave the trail for a moment. I crouched behind a fallen log a few feet off the path and waited. My breathing was ragged, and I tried to quiet it as much as I could. For a while, nothing happened. My muscles ached from staying crouched, and I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Then I heard it again, slow, steady steps on the dirt path where I had just been walking. I froze completely, barely blinking. The footsteps stopped near where I had left the trail. Silence. I waited, heart hammering, but I didn't hear them move again. Minutes passed. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I peeked slowly over the log. The trail was empty, but the feeling that someone had been there lingered, stronger than ever. I forced myself back onto the path and walked as quickly as I could without running. My legs were tired, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't stop again, not even to drink. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long across the trail, and I knew I was running out of daylight. My plan had been to reach a small campsite near the ridge before dark, but with the pace I was keeping, I wasn't sure if I'd make it. The noises had faded for a while, and part of me started to believe I had lost whoever or whatever was following me. But just as the trail bent around a cluster of boulders, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure. It was far back, partly hidden by the trees, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was on the trail behind me. I didn't stop this time. I didn't even turn my head. I kept walking, faster and faster, every nerve in my body screaming. By the time the campsite came into view, it was nearly dark. The small clearing was nothing more than a flat patch of dirt with a stone fire ring in the middle. I dropped my pack, hands shaking, and pulled out my flashlight. I didn't want to stay, but I was too exhausted to keep going. I forced myself to set up quickly, keeping the light low, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The night was long. Every sound made me jump. Branches creaked in the wind, leaves rustled, and sometimes I swore I heard footsteps again circling just beyond the edge of the clearing. I barely slept, clutching the knife from my pack and waiting for morning. When the first light broke, I packed everything in minutes and hit the trail again. My body ached, but fear drove me forward. I wanted out of those woods as fast as possible. The trail wound back down the mountain, and I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see the figure again. My throat was dry, my stomach knotted, but I didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like forever, the trees thinned, and I saw the gravel lot through the branches. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. But as I stepped into the open and spotted my car sitting alone in the lot, I realized something. There were fresh footprints in the dirt. Not just mine. They circled near my car, pacing back and forth, and then disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait to think about it. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror again and again, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But no one came. The mountain faded behind me, but the unease didn't. Whoever had followed me never showed themselves. They never spoke. They never attacked. But they had been there the whole time, close enough for me to hear them, close enough to leave prints by my car. I never went back to that trail, and I never hike alone anymore. I had been hiking for years, and I thought I understood the risks that came with it. I always carried the right gear, I always checked the weather, and I never strayed too far from marked trails. I liked to think I was careful, But that trip taught me how thin the line really is between safety and disaster, and how fast everything can go wrong even when you think you're doing everything right. It was early September, and I had taken a week off work to go hiking alone in the mountains. The summer heat was finally starting to fade, but the days were still long enough to cover good ground before night fell. I wanted a route that was quiet, something less crowded than the popular loops people filled on weekends. I spent days looking at maps and finally picked an area with high ridges, steep valleys, and a trail system that didn't see as much traffic. It wasn't the kind of wilderness where you'd vanish off the face of the earth without a trace, but it was remote enough that if something went wrong, help wouldn't be quick to arrive. I parked at the small gravel lot early in the morning, around 6:30 a.m. There were no other cars. I checked my gear again before starting. Backpack with food, water filter, headlamp, extra batteries, sleeping bag, tent, lighter, knife, small first aid kit, map, and compass. I also had trekking poles, which I usually found unnecessary, but I brought them anyway because the map showed steep climbs. My boots were broken in, my socks thick, and I layered my clothes to adjust for the changing temperatures. The trail began easy enough. A wide dirt path ran through tall pines, their needles damp with dew. The air was cool and smelled sharp, and I could hear the faint sound of water somewhere downhill. The morning light filtered through the trees in soft beams, and for a while I just moved steadily, falling into a rhythm. My breathing was calm, my pack sat comfortably on my back, and I kept my pace measured. I had a goal to reach a ridge by afternoon where I could set up camp. About 2 hours in, the trail narrowed and started climbing. Roots crossed the dirt like veins, and rocks jutted out, forcing me to step carefully. The trees thinned as I gained elevation, and the view began to open. Layers of mountains rolled away in the distance, their slopes heavy with forest. It was beautiful, but I kept my focus on footing. I knew from experience how easy it was to get careless when distracted by views. By late morning, I reached a section of switchbacks carved into the slope. The climb was steep, and sweat dampened my shirt. I stopped halfway to drink water and check the map. The line on the paper showed I was on track, and the ridge wasn't too far now. I pressed on, slowing as the grade steepened further. The dirt grew looser, sliding under my boots, and I dug in with the trekking poles to keep balance. Finally, the trail leveled out onto the ridge. The trees here were shorter, wind-shaped, and spaced wider apart. Patches of grass and bare rock broke up the ground. The view on both sides stretched far, valleys dropping sharply away into shadows. I felt exposed but also exhilarated. The air was cooler here, and the wind carried a steady push. I checked the sun and saw I had plenty of time before dark. I decided to keep moving along the ridge to find a sheltered spot to camp. The ridge trail wasn't wide. In many places, it was little more than a narrow line of dirt with steep drop-offs on both sides. It wasn't sheer cliff, but it was steep enough that a fall could mean broken bones or worse. I slowed my pace, making sure each step was solid before shifting my weight. I gripped the poles harder, thankful I had brought them. The further I went, the narrower it became. At one point, the path squeezed to barely wider than my boots. On my left, the ground fell into a slope of loose rock and scrub. On my right, the drop went sharper, straight down to treetops far below. I stopped, breathing slowly, and studied the section. Turning back was an option, but that would mean climbing all the way down the switchbacks and losing half the day. I convinced myself it wasn't impossible. Many hikers had crossed before. If they could do it, I could too. I moved carefully, one step at a time, planting the poles ahead of me for stability. The wind pressed against my back, making me lean forward slightly. My heart pounded harder than the effort demanded, nerves tightening every muscle. My boots slid slightly on the loose dirt, but I adjusted and kept moving. Step by step, I crossed the narrowest part, and when I reached the wider ground beyond, I let out a long breath. I continued along the ridge, shaken but still determined. I found a small clearing between twisted trees where the ground was level enough for a tent. It was sheltered from the worst of the wind, and the view looked out across endless ridges fading blue into the distance. I dropped my pack, stretched, and set up camp. By evening, the The sky burned orange and pink. I ate a simple meal of dried food and granola, drinking filtered water from a nearby spring I had found trickling through rocks. As the sun slipped lower, the wind grew colder, and I pulled on a jacket. The world around me was silent except for the constant rush of air and the distant cry of a bird. When darkness finally settled, I climbed into the tent and zipped myself inside. The nylon walls rustled with each gust, and the ground beneath felt firm. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the faint glow of the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of the wind. My mind wandered back to the narrow section I had crossed earlier. I pictured the slope dropping away, the dirt sliding under my boots. I told myself I had handled it fine, but part of me felt uneasy knowing I'd have to cross it again in the morning. Sleep came in fits. I woke several times, shifting against the cold seeping through the ground. The sound of wind sometimes rose into a howl, shaking the tent poles. At one point I thought I heard a faint rumble, like rocks shifting, but it faded quickly. I told myself it was just wind moving debris. When dawn came, the sky was pale and the air sharp. I packed quickly, eager to get moving before the wind picked up stronger. My goal was to cross back over the ridge, descend the switchbacks, and loop around toward the valley trails. I ate a small breakfast, tightened my pack straps, and started back the way I had come. The narrow section came sooner than I expected. The dirt strip stretched across the ridge like a scar, dropping steep on both sides. My stomach knotted. The wind had grown stronger since yesterday, and I could feel it pulling at my jacket as I stood still. I told myself again it was possible that others had crossed it, but my hands were damp with sweat even in the cold air. I stepped forward, planting the poles carefully. The dirt shifted under my boots, sliding a little, but I adjusted. I kept my eyes on the ground ahead, not on the drop. One step, then another. The wind gusted suddenly, pushing me sideways, and I froze, jamming the poles into the ground to steady myself. My heart slammed in my chest. For a second, I thought I was going to lose balance. I forced my weight down, bent my knees, and waited for the gust to ease. When it did, I inched forward again. Halfway across, my right foot slipped on loose dirt. The boot skidded sideways, and I dropped low, stabbing the pole down hard. The tip struck rock and held. My body tilted, pack dragging me toward the slope, but I clung to the poles, forcing my foot back under me. My chest heaved and every muscle trembled. I stayed crouched, barely moving, until my breath slowed. I wanted to back up, but I knew turning around was more dangerous than continuing. I swallowed dryly and kept moving. When I finally stepped onto wider ground, I collapsed to my knees, shaking. I had made it, but the thought of how close I'd come to falling left me sick. The rest of the descent was steady but slow. I kept picturing that slip, the way the ground had slid away. By the time I reached the switchbacks, my legs were rubber. I moved carefully, gripping branches and rocks, until I reached the forest floor. I followed the trail down into the valley, where the wind was weaker and the trees thicker. Relief spread through me, but it was mixed with something else. A hard lesson carved into my nerves. I had underestimated the risk of that ridge. A single misstep could have ended everything, and no amount of gear or planning would have mattered. When I finally reached the trailhead, hours later, my car sat alone in the lot. I dropped my pack in the trunk and sat behind the wheel, staring at my hands still trembling faintly. I knew I had been lucky. The mountains had reminded me how small I was, how fragile even careful steps could be. That night, back home, the slip replayed in my mind again and again. I could feel the dirt giving way, the wind pressing, the hollow space below waiting. I had crossed it, but not because of skill or strength. It was luck, and luck doesn't last forever. I realized then that some trails aren't worth it. The mountains will always be there, but I might not be if I push too far. And from that day on, whenever I planned a hike, I looked at the maps differently. Not just for distance or views, but for the risks hidden in narrow ridges and steep drops. Because I knew how close I had come, and I had planned the hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a solo trip, something I liked to do every now and then when I felt the need to clear my head and reset. Most of my friends thought it was strange that I preferred going alone, but for me, it was part of the experience. Being on my own in the wilderness made me more alert, more tuned in to everything around me. I liked the silence, the steady sound of my boots on dirt, the rhythm of my breathing, the feeling that every step was mine to make. The plan was simple. I would drive out to a mountain range about 4 hours from where I lived. The area had plenty of trails, but I had marked one in particular. A loop that was supposed to be around 20 miles long, climbing up along ridges and cutting down through valleys before circling back near the trailhead. I had checked the maps over and over, studied the terrain, and read trail reports online. Everything looked manageable. The route wasn't too popular, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully the night before. A 35-liter pack with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, fuel, dehydrated meals, water bottles, a filter, first aid kit, extra socks, and a lightweight down jacket. I added my knife, flashlight, headlamp, spare batteries, compass, and printed maps. My phone would come along, but I knew service was spotty at best in that area. I packed extra food in case something delayed me. I wasn't worried. I had done harder hikes before. When I arrived the morning of the hike, the lot at the trailhead was nearly empty. Just one pickup truck with an old camper shell and another small sedan. The air was cool, the sun was just coming up, and the forest around me was still damp with dew. I locked my car, swung my pack onto my shoulders, and started walking. The first part of the trail was straightforward. It followed a narrow dirt path through tall pines, with the sound of a stream somewhere off to my right. The smell of wet earth and pine needles was strong, and the morning air felt sharp in my lungs. My boots sank slightly into the soft dirt. I moved at a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow, just enough to warm up. For the first couple of hours, everything was peaceful. Birds called from high branches, and every now and then a squirrel darted across the trail. I passed a few small clearings where sunlight broke through, warming patches of tall grass. I drank from my water bottle and adjusted my straps now and then, but otherwise kept moving. By late morning, the trail began to climb. The switchbacks grew steeper, the trees thinner, and I could see glimpses of the ridge above through the gaps. My breathing grew heavier, but I liked the burn in my legs. It meant I was making progress. I stopped for a quick snack, a protein bar and some dried fruit, before pushing on. Around noon, I reached a narrow ridge. The view spread wide on both sides, valleys and forests stretching as far as I could see. The sky was a deep blue, the sun bright but not yet hot. I paused for a while, catching my breath, enjoying the sight. That was when I noticed something strange. On the far slope, just below the ridge, I saw what looked like a faint trail. It wasn't on my map, curved along the hillside, partly hidden by brush. From where I stood, it looked old, maybe even overgrown. I stared at it for a while, debating whether it was just a game trail or something more. I told myself to ignore it. I had a route, a plan, and no reason to wander, so I kept going. The ridge stretched for a while before dropping into a thickly wooded valley. I followed the switchbacks down, the shade cool under the tall trees. The air smelled different here, heavier, as if the valley held on to moisture longer than the ridge. The ground was littered with wet leaves, and I had to watch my footing. That was when I began to feel it, the quiet. It wasn't the normal quiet of the forest, with birds and insects filling the air. It was heavier, emptier, the kind of quiet where you notice your own breathing too much. I slowed, listening. No birdsong, no wind through branches, not even the scratch of squirrels in the undergrowth. Just stillness. I shook it off at first. Maybe it was just the time of day. Maybe animals were napping. I adjusted my pack and kept moving, but the feeling stayed with me. As the afternoon wore on, the trail twisted deeper into the valley. The trees pressed closer together here, tall trunks blocking out most of the sky. The air grew cooler, shadows stretching across the path. My boots crunched over damp soil, broken twigs, and patches of moss. I kept expecting the silence to break, but it didn't. At one point, I bent to refill my bottle at a stream. As I crouched down, I noticed something in the mud. Prints. Not boot prints. They were barefoot, human-shaped, small, like a child's, though too long in the toes. The tracks led away from the water and disappeared into the trees. I froze. It didn't make sense. The trail was remote, far from homes or campsites. Who would be barefoot out here? And why were the prints fresh? The edges hadn't eroded. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just odd erosion or an animal track that looked human. But I knew what I had seen. The shape was too clear. I didn't follow them. I forced myself to turn back to the trail and keep going. As the hours passed, I felt a growing unease. Every time I stopped to adjust my gear, I thought I heard faint movement in the trees. Not close, but not far either. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. When I looked, I saw nothing. The silence pressed harder. By evening, I reached a flat area near the base of the valley. My legs ached and I needed to rest. I set up camp quickly, choosing a spot a few yards off the trail. I pitched my tent, gathered water, and boiled a simple meal. The act of cooking helped steady me. The warmth of food in my stomach eased the edge of anxiety. But when darkness fell, the unease returned. The forest around me was too quiet. I lay in my tent, headlamp turned off, listening. The silence was so heavy I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Every few minutes, I thought I caught a faint sound, a distant crack of wood, a soft shuffle. My body stayed tense, waiting. Sleep came in short bursts. I woke often, sweating, certain I had heard something just outside the tent. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass by, faint against the dim moonlight filtering through the fabric. But when I forced myself to sit up and look, there was nothing. Morning came slow, the sky pale and gray. I packed quickly, eager to move. My body felt stiff, my nerves raw. I told myself I just needed to finish the loop and get back to the car. One more day, maybe less if I pushed. The trail climbed again, winding up the far side of the valley. The ascent was grueling, but I welcomed the burn in my muscles. It distracted me from the lingering fear. By midday, I noticed it again. More prints, bare feet pressed into the damp soil of the trail. This time they were larger, longer strides, moving in the same direction I was heading. I stopped, staring at them, my throat dry. Whoever it was, they were ahead of me, and they weren't wearing shoes. I felt the urge to turn back, but going back meant retracing miles, climbing the ridge again, losing hours. Moving forward was shorter. At least that's what I told myself. The higher I climbed, the more I felt it, that sensation of being watched. Every hair on my neck stood. I forced myself to keep walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, slipping through the trees just beyond sight, matching my pace. When I stopped, the forest seemed to stop too. When I moved, I thought I heard faint echoes behind me. The fear built until my chest hurt with every breath. That night, I didn't make camp. I pushed hard, walking long past sunset, my headlamp casting a narrow beam on the trail. The light caught roots, rocks, patches of moss, but never what I most dreaded to see. My legs shook with exhaustion, but I kept moving. I wanted out. Finally, near midnight, I stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed, too tired to continue. I didn't bother pitching the tent. I laid the bag on the ground, crawled in, and left my headlamp on beside me. I slept poorly, jerking awake at the faintest sound. At one point, I opened my eyes and saw the outline of a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and still. My chest locked, breath trapped. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. At dawn, I forced myself up, every muscle aching. I should have been close to the loop's end by then. I stumbled on, desperate. The trail twisted down through thick brush, then opened onto a wide gravel path I recognized from the map. Relief hit me so hard I nearly cried. I knew this path led straight back to the trailhead. I quickened my pace, ignoring the burning in my legs. My boots crunched over gravel. The forest grew lighter, the trees thinner. I could almost see the end. That was when I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me, not echoes of my own, but distinct, steady steps. have always liked hiking, but I was never one of those people who tried to turn it into some kind of competition. I didn't care about breaking records, going to the highest summits, or crossing off long lists of trails. For me, it was always about clearing my head and finding some space away from busy towns and loud streets. Most of the time, I picked easier trails that wrapped around lakes or followed gentle hills through the woods. But there was one trip I decided to push myself a little further, and that trip turned out to be the most frightening experience of my life. It happened about 6 years ago. I had taken a week off work in late summer, just before September started, when the air was still warm during the day but cooler in the evenings. I wanted to spend that week hiking alone. I had no problem with solitude. In fact, sometimes being alone in the wilderness gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. My plan was simple: spend a few days exploring trails in the mountain range about 4 hours drive from where I lived. I picked out a route called the Narrow Ridge Trail. It wasn't extremely long, maybe 12 miles end to end, but it had a reputation for being rough in certain sections. Some hikers mentioned steep drop-offs and sections where the path shrank to no wider than a person's shoulders. Others talked about loose rocks, sudden turns, and cliffs that seemed to come out of nowhere. The warnings made it sound intimidating, but they also made me curious. I thought that if I took it slow, carried the right supplies, and stayed cautious, I would be fine. I woke up early, drove to the trailhead, and parked my car in a small gravel lot surrounded by tall pines. There were only 3 other vehicles parked there. The lot was quiet except for the sound of birds somewhere high up in the trees. I stepped out of the car, stretched, and loaded my backpack onto my shoulders. I had packed water, energy bars, a first aid kit, a headlamp, a rain jacket, a map, and a whistle. I always carried more than I thought I needed, because the thought of being caught unprepared in the woods was far worse than carrying a few extra pounds on my back. The trail began gently. The first couple of miles led me through thick woods where the air felt heavy with the scent of pine needles. The ground was soft under my boots, covered in layers of old leaves and broken twigs. Sunlight filtered through the branches in patches, warming my arms every now and then as I walked. I felt calm. I heard squirrels rustling through the undergrowth, the call of a hawk somewhere far off, and the crunch of my own steps. After about an hour, the trail started climbing more sharply. The trees thinned, replaced by jagged rocks and smaller shrubs clinging to the slopes. The sun was stronger here, and sweat began to form on my neck and back. I stopped a few times to sip water, studying the map to see how far I had come. I still had plenty of daylight left, and according to the map, I was not even halfway to the ridge section that gave the trail its name. By noon, I reached a part where the trail narrowed and ran alongside a steep slope. To my left, the ground rose upward into a wall of gray rock. To my right, the land dropped away into a valley filled with treetops that looked small from this height. The path was only wide enough for a single person, and the dirt beneath my boots had small loose stones mixed in. I moved carefully, planting each step before shifting my weight forward. My hands brushed against the rock wall beside me, using it for balance. The ridge section stretched on longer than I expected. At times, the trail felt barely wide enough to support me. Some parts had crumbled edges where the dirt had eroded away. I felt my stomach tighten each time my boots dislodged small rocks and sent them tumbling down the slope. I kept reminding myself to stay calm, to take it slow. The wind picked up as I walked along the ridge, pushing against my body, making me feel even more exposed. Eventually, I reached a wider area where the trail split around a cluster of boulders. I stopped to rest, dropping my backpack on the ground and sitting against one of the rocks. From this spot, the view of the mountains stretched far in every direction. I could see layers of ridges fading into the distance, their blue-gray outlines blurred by haze. I took out a granola bar and chewed slowly, trying not to think about how high up I was. That was when I noticed something. On the dirt just a few feet away, near the edge of the trail, I saw fresh shoe prints. They were different from my own. The soles had a distinct pattern, sharper and newer than the worn-out tread on my boots. At first, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of hikers used this trail. But as I looked closer, I realized something strange. The prints seemed rushed, uneven, like whoever had left them was moving quickly or stumbling. Some were pressed deep into the dirt, while others slid sideways, leaving smudged streaks. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. The prints led forward along the ridge, toward the narrowest part of the trail. Something about them made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain exactly why. Maybe it was the way they zigzagged, like the person had lost their balance more than once. I tried to shake off the thought. People hiked at different paces, and not everyone moved steadily. It didn't have to mean anything. I stood, tightened the straps of my backpack, and continued. The trail grew narrower again, winding along sharp drops and tight corners. The prints stayed ahead of me, always fresh, as if they had been made not long before I arrived. I followed them for what felt like another half-mile until I reached a section where the trail suddenly ended in a collapse. A large piece of the path had crumbled away, leaving only a thin ledge hugging the side of the cliff. I stopped, staring at it. The prints went right up to the edge, then continued across the ledge. My throat went dry. The ledge looked barely wide enough for a boot, maybe a foot at most. Below, it was a sheer drop into the valley. The ground was littered with broken rocks, showing where the trail had given way in the past. I crouched down and studied the prints. Whoever had gone across had pressed their shoes tightly against the wall as they edged along. Some of the dirt had crumbled beneath their weight, leaving small gaps in the trail. My stomach twisted again. I wondered who had crossed here and why they would risk it. I backed away a step, trying to decide if I should attempt the ledge myself. I knew the trail eventually looped around and rejoined safer sections, but if I turned back now, I would lose hours of daylight. Still, crossing felt reckless. My hands felt damp with sweat just thinking about it. I stood there for a long time, weighing my options. Finally, I decided I would try. I pressed myself against the rock wall, placed one boot carefully on the ledge, and shifted forward. My heart hammered in my chest. The drop beside me seemed to pull at my body, making me feel off balance. I moved slowly, one step at a time, breathing shallowly. Halfway across, my boot slipped slightly on a patch of loose dirt. My body jolted sideways, and for a moment I felt weightless. I slammed my shoulder against the rock wall, pressing myself hard against it. My breath came fast and shallow. I forced myself to stay still, waiting for the tremor in my legs to pass. Then I moved again, inch by inch, until I reached the other side. When my boots hit solid ground, I exhaled sharply and leaned against the rock. My arms trembled. I glanced back at the ledge, at the prints that continued behind me, and felt a sharp unease. Whoever had gone before me had risked the same thing. The thought of slipping, of disappearing into that valley, lingered in my mind. I pushed forward, trying to shake the feeling. But as the afternoon went on, things grew stranger. The prints I had been following did not disappear. They stayed ahead of me, always fresh, always sharp in the dirt. At first, I thought maybe they belonged to someone not far ahead. But I never saw anyone. No voices, no movement, no sound of boots on rock. Just prints winding along the trail, always there. The sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the ridge. The trail dipped into a patch of stunted trees before climbing again. I hurried, knowing I needed to find a safe place to stop before dark. The ridge was no place to be caught in the night. I had planned the hike for months, marking the trail on a paper map and double-checking the route with online maps. It was supposed to be a 3-day loop, about 40 miles total, through rough country that didn't see much traffic. Most people avoided it because it was overgrown, and there were no easy exits if something went wrong. That was part of the appeal for me. I liked quiet places, places where you could walk for hours and not see anyone else. The morning I started, the air was cool and still. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but there was enough light to move without a headlamp. I parked my car near the gravel pull-off that marked the start of the trail. My backpack was heavy, about 40 pounds, with food, water, a tent, sleeping bag, and all the basics. I had packed carefully, making sure I had what I needed but nothing extra. I tightened the straps on my shoulders, checked that the map was folded in my pocket, and started walking. The the first stretch of trail wound through pine forest. The ground was soft with needles, and I could hear birds calling above me. The smell of sap was strong in the air. It was peaceful, the kind of morning where every step feels easy. I kept a steady pace, knowing that the hardest parts would come later. After about an hour, the trail began to climb. It wasn't steep at first, just a gradual rise, but I could feel the pull in my legs. I stopped once to adjust my boots and take a drink of water. The forest grew denser as I went higher, with branches hanging low across the path. Some parts of the trail were faint, almost lost under weeds, and I had to push through brush that scraped against my arms. I checked the map again at a junction where a smaller path cut off, making sure I stayed on the main loop. My plan was to reach a ridge by mid-afternoon and set up camp there for the first night. That ridge was supposed to have a good view of the valley below, and I thought it would be a good place to rest. The hours passed. I walked, climbed, sweated, and paused to catch my breath. At times the trail dropped into ravines where it was damp and cool, then climbed back into drier, rockier ground. I saw no one the entire day. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was sinking low and the shadows stretched long. I found a flat spot among the trees and set up my tent. I boiled water, made a quick meal, and sat eating while the sky darkened. The wind picked up slightly, but it wasn't bad. The forest creaked and rustled in the breeze. I felt tired but content. That first night passed without trouble. I slept heavily and woke to the sound of birds again. I packed up, ate some oatmeal, and started the second day's hike. This day was meant to be the hardest. A long section through steep terrain where the trail narrowed to little more than a footpath carved into the hillside. By mid-morning, I was already sweating. The trail tilted sharply upward, switchbacking up the side of a mountain. My pack dug into my shoulders and sweat ran down my face. I stopped often to catch my breath. When I finally reached the top, the view was wide and beautiful, the valley spreading out far below. For a few minutes, I stood there just breathing and looking. But the descent on the other side was worse. The path dropped fast, covered in loose rocks that shifted under my boots. I had to move slowly to avoid slipping. My thighs ached from the strain of holding back my weight. More than once I stumbled and caught myself just in time. It was during one of these descents that I noticed something strange. The trail markers, small painted blazes on trees, were gone. At first I thought I had missed one, but as I kept walking, I realized they simply weren't there. The trail itself was faint, covered in leaves and broken branches. I checked my map, but it wasn't detailed enough to show every bend. I kept going, thinking the markers would pick up again, but they didn't. After another half hour, I began to feel uneasy. The path under my feet was more like an animal track than a human trail. I stopped, looked around, and tried to match the landmarks with my map. Nothing fit. The ridges and valleys didn't line up the way they should have. I decided to backtrack. That's what you're supposed to do when you lose a trail. Turn around and go back to the last place you were sure of. I walked uphill again, scanning the trees for paint or carved signs. My legs burned with the climb, and sweat soaked my shirt. I kept expecting to see the junction I had passed earlier, but it didn't appear. Time passed. I checked my watch. An hour had gone by, then another. I still hadn't found the right spot. Every tree looked the same, every slope blended into the next. The unease grew into real worry. By mid-afternoon, I admitted I was lost. That realization hit hard. The sun was hot overhead, and the air felt heavier. My water was running low. I sat on a rock and spread the map out on my knees, tracing lines with my finger, trying to figure out where I might be. But without trail markers, it was guesswork. I chose a direction downhill, thinking it would lead me toward the valley where I could find a stream. Water was more important than anything at that point. I started walking, pushing through brush, stepping over logs, sliding down loose dirt. Branches slapped against my arms, leaving scratches. After about an hour, I found water, a narrow stream trickling between rocks. Relief washed over me. I dropped to my knees, filled my bottle, and drank deeply. The water was cold and clean. I felt better, but I knew water alone wasn't enough. I needed to find the trail again. I decided to follow the stream, thinking it might lead to a larger river or a landmark I could recognize. The stream twisted and turned, sometimes widening, sometimes narrowing to nothing. I had to climb over boulders and push through thickets of brush. The ground was uneven and slippery. The hours dragged. My legs grew heavier. The forest pressed in close, darkening as the sun lowered. I realized I had no clear place to camp. The ground was sloped and rocky, and I couldn't find a flat area large enough for my tent. As the light faded, I grew more desperate. I finally cleared a small patch among rocks and set up my tent there, even though it wasn't level. I boiled more water, ate a small meal, and lay down. That night was different. Couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the tent set me on edge. The snap of branches, the rustle of leaves. My mind kept turning over the situation. I was alone, off trail, and no one knew exactly where I had gone. If I couldn't find my way back, no one would stumble across me by chance. When I did sleep, it was shallow and broken. I woke often, heart racing, listening for something in the darkness. The third morning, I felt drained. My body was stiff, my eyes heavy. I forced myself up, packed slowly, and started walking again. I kept following the stream, hoping it would lead somewhere. By midday, the stream disappeared into a tangle of swampy ground. The air was thick with mosquitoes, and my boots sank into mud. I cursed myself for trusting the stream and turned uphill, trying to get back to higher ground. My clothes were soaked with sweat and mud, and my pack felt twice as heavy. The hours stretched on. My stomach growled, but I rationed my food, eating little. My throat stayed dry even though I drank often. The fear grew sharper. Every step felt like it took me farther from safety instead of closer. That night, I camped in another rough spot. My body ached all over. I lay in the dark, listening again to every sound, my nerves raw. I thought about my car sitting at the trailhead, miles and miles away. I thought about people at home who assumed I was fine. I thought about how easy it would be to make a mistake here, one bad fall, and not be able to move. On the fourth day, I woke to clouds. The sky was heavy and gray, and the air smelled like rain. I knew it would only make things worse. Wet ground, harder walking, and no chance of starting a fire to stay warm. I pushed on anyway, climbing ridges, sliding down gullies, moving until my legs trembled. My compass needle swung steady, and I tried to keep a general direction. I told myself if I just kept walking, eventually I'd cross a road or a known trail. By late afternoon, it began to rain. First light drops, then a steady downpour. Everything turned slick. My clothes clung to me, soaked through. The map turned soft and tore at the edges. I stuffed it back in my pocket and kept going. The rain didn't stop that night. I set up the tent under dripping trees, the ground already soaked. Water seeped under the floor, chilling me. I lay awake, teeth chattering, every part of me sore and exhausted. I wondered how long I could keep this up. The next morning, the rain had eased, but fog hung thick between the trees. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. I packed up anyway and walked again. My body felt weaker now, slower. My food was running low. Sometime around midday, I stumbled onto something I hadn't seen in days. A faint trail. It was narrow and overgrown, but it was a trail with footprints pressed into the mud. My chest tightened with relief. I followed it, almost running, ignoring the ache in my legs. The trail widened as I went, then joined another. I never thought a simple hike could turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. I had done many hikes before, long ones, short ones, the kind where you spend hours sweating and pushing yourself, and the kind where you just enjoy a short walk and head back for dinner. But the one I did last fall changed the way I look at the outdoors forever. I decided to do it alone. That was my first mistake, though at the time it felt normal. I had done solo hikes before, and I liked the silence, the way the trees swallowed up all the noise from the world. I carried the same setup I always did. A backpack with water bottles, protein bars, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, a knife, a lighter, and my phone with a portable charger. I also had a paper map folded neatly in a plastic bag, because I had been told too many times not to trust cell service in the backcountry. The hike I picked was in a national forest that I hadn't explored before. It was supposed to be about 15 miles round trip, starting at a trailhead near a gravel road and leading up to an overlook that promised a wide open view of the valley. The pictures online made it look peaceful and rewarding. People wrote about the climb being tiring but worth it, and most said they finished in a day. I figured I could do the same. I had the whole Saturday open, and I told myself that if I started early, I'd be back at my car before dark. The trail started off smooth. The ground was damp with fallen leaves, and I could smell the earthy mix of wet dirt and pine needles. The first few miles were easy, the path wide enough that I didn't have to pay close attention to my steps. The sun was just climbing up over the ridge, spilling light through the branches in long stripes. The air was cool, sharp against my lungs. I walked steadily, my boots crunching the ground, my breath making small clouds in the air. At that point, it was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, steady, calming. I passed no one, which didn't surprise me. It was October, and not many people wanted to be out in the cold. After a couple of hours, the trail grew narrower, rockier. The climb became steeper, forcing me to slow down. My thighs burned, and sweat rolled down my back even though the air stayed cold. I kept looking up, thinking the overlook would be around the next bend. But every time I reached what looked like the top, I found more trail stretching ahead. When I finally reached the overlook, it was already past noon. The valley opened wide below me, with trees spreading out in every direction. Patches of red and orange leaves broke up the green, a sign of the season shifting. A river cut through the valley, shining in the sunlight. I dropped my backpack and sat on a flat rock, eating a protein bar and gulping down water. For a few minutes, it felt worth it. I thought about how quiet the world was up there, how far away everything felt. But the quiet also carried weight. The longer I sat, the more I noticed how empty the woods were. No voices, no planes overhead, no distant cars. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of a branch. I tried to brush it off. This was what I had wanted, solitude. By the time I stood up to start heading back, the sun had shifted lower than I expected. That gave me a small jolt of worry. The hike down would be faster than the climb, but I couldn't afford to waste time. I tightened the straps of my backpack and started back. First, it went fine. I retraced my steps carefully, keeping my eyes on the trail. But after an hour, I came to a fork I didn't remember. The trail split in two directions, both looking worn by footsteps. My stomach sank. I pulled out the map, but the lines on the paper didn't show every little split. I tried to remember which way I had come from, but the forest had a way of making everything look the same. I chose the left path, telling myself it would reconnect to the main trail. I walked fast, trying to beat the dropping sun. The shadows grew longer, the air colder. I kept expecting to see landmarks I remembered from the climb up, but nothing looked familiar. The path twisted down into a hollow where the trees grew thick. The light dimmed so much it felt like dusk, even though I knew it wasn't that late yet. I pulled out my phone to check the time and saw that I had no service. That didn't surprise me, but the time did. Almost 4 o'clock. I walked faster, my boots scuffing the rocks, my backpack thumping with each step. My heartbeat picked up, not just from the pace, but from the unease that settled heavier in my chest. I kept going, telling myself it would eventually lead back to the main trail. But the path only narrowed more. Roots tangled across it, and brambles clawed at my legs. After another 30 minutes, I knew for sure I was off the real trail. The track I was on looked more like a game trail, the kind animals made, not people. I stopped and tried to calm myself. I knew panic would only make things worse. I dug out the map again, but the lines on it didn't help much when the forest around me didn't match any landmarks. I decided to backtrack to the fork. That's when the fear started to really bite at me. Backtracking meant retracing my steps carefully, but the light was fading fast. The shadows between the trees stretched long and deep, and the temperature dropped enough that I could see my breath. I walked quickly, trying to stay calm. I didn't find the fork. I should have reached it within 30 minutes, but an hour passed, and the forest only grew darker. Somehow I had missed it, Somehow, I had gone wrong even while trying to go back. My stomach tightened. I realized I was truly lost. I tried to steady myself. I had supplies. I had a flashlight, food, and water. I wouldn't die that night, but the thought of spending the night alone in the forest froze me more than the cold air did. I kept walking, searching for anything familiar, but the trees closed in tighter. Every direction looked the same. The crunch of leaves under my boots grew louder in the silence. At times, I thought I heard movement behind me, but when I stopped, all I heard was my own breathing. When the last of the daylight drained away, I pulled out my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark but only reached so far. The woods outside the circle of light looked endless. I walked until my legs ached, then finally admitted I couldn't keep moving blindly. I found a spot near a thick tree and dropped my backpack. My hands shook as I lit a small fire with the lighter and some dry leaves. The flames gave off weak warmth but made me feel less exposed. I sat close to it, knees pulled up, and listened to the forest around me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves made me flinch. I kept imagining animals creeping close, watching from the shadows. The night dragged slow. My body shivered from the cold, and my eyes burned from trying not to close. I dozed off a few times, only to jerk awake at some noise in the dark. At one point, I thought I heard heavy steps moving in the leaves, but when I aimed my flashlight, there was nothing. By dawn, my throat was dry and my body stiff. The fire had died to ash. My nerves were raw, but I knew I had to move. Sitting there wouldn't save me. I packed up and started walking again, picking a direction and sticking to it. The map was useless now. My only hope was to find some sign of the trail or maybe stumble on a road. The second day blurred into hours of walking. The sun climbed and fell, and I kept moving, drinking from my bottles and rationing the food. The terrain rose and fell in ridges, making my legs burn. I slipped a few times, scraping my hands on rocks. By afternoon, I found a stream and nearly collapsed beside it. I refilled my bottles, drank deeply, and forced myself to keep going. Streams usually led somewhere, I told myself. Maybe if I followed it, I'd find people. But the stream twisted endlessly, winding through valleys and between ridges. As the second evening came, I still hadn't found anything. My stomach clenched with hunger. I had one protein bar left. That night, I didn't bother making a fire. I curled against a tree, clutching the flashlight, too tired to do anything else. The darkness pressed in on me, and I fought sleep, afraid of what I might wake to. The next morning, weak and shaking, I pushed myself up and kept following the stream. My lips were cracked, and my legs felt like they carried lead. My mind started to blur, drifting into half-thoughts. Then I saw it, a flash of something unnatural through the trees. I pushed forward and broke out onto a rough dirt road. The sight nearly dropped me to my knees. I staggered onto it, turning one way, then the other. My legs carried me down the road until, finally, I heard the distant hum of an engine. A truck rounded the bend, and I stumbled into its path, waving my arms. The driver slammed on the brakes, and I collapsed in the dust, shaking with relief. I had been lost for nearly 3 days. I never hiked alone again after that. Even now, when I think about the silence of those woods, the endless trees with no trail to follow, I feel my chest tighten. I learned that the forest doesn't care about you, doesn't care if you're prepared or confident. If you take one wrong turn, it can swallow you whole. I had been planning a long hike for weeks. I wanted something that would take me deep into the mountains, far away from roads, noise, and everything that tied me to my normal routine. I needed space and I wanted to push myself. I had gone on multi-day hikes before, but this time I wanted to pick a trail that wasn't well-traveled. I had been studying maps, trip reports, and even older Forest Service notes until I pieced together a route that looked both tough and rewarding. It was a loop trail that cut through a rugged section of national forest, climbing up a ridge, dropping into a remote valley, then circling back along a river. Most people avoided this section because it wasn't as popular as the main trails. The trail was still marked, but from everything I read, it was rough, poorly maintained, and overgrown in places. That was exactly what I was looking for: solitude and challenge. I packed carefully the night before: tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra food, water filter, first aid kit, and all the small items I knew I'd need if anything went wrong. I double-checked everything twice because I had a habit of leaving behind something important. I added an extra day's worth of food, just in case, and a portable charger for my phone, even though I knew reception would disappear quickly. The morning I set out, the air was cool, with a thin layer of fog hanging low over the valley. I parked at a small dirt lot near the trailhead. There were no other cars there, which gave me the strange comfort I was seeking. I adjusted the straps of my pack and stepped into the trees. The first few miles were easy. The trail wound through thick pine forests, and the ground was soft with fallen needles. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the silence. I crossed small wooden footbridges over streams, and every time the trail rose, I could see faint light breaking through the trees above. I was making good progress, and my mind was calm. After about 4 hours, the trail started climbing steeply. My legs burned as I made my way up the ridge, switchback after switchback. I stopped often to drink water and catch my breath. By midday, I reached the top, and the forest opened up. The ridge stretched out before me, narrow in some spots with drops on either side. I could see for miles the rolling hills below, a river snaking through the valley, and snow still clinging to the higher peaks. I ate a quick lunch, sitting on a flat rock, enjoying the view. From there, the trail descended sharply into the valley. The trees grew denser again, and sunlight barely reached the ground. The trail was harder to follow in some spots, covered with fallen branches and thick brush. I had to push through thorny plants and climb over rotting logs. My pace slowed, but I wasn't in a hurry. By late afternoon, I reached the valley floor. A creek ran through it, its water cold and clear. I filtered water, refilled my bottles, and decided to set up camp nearby. I found a small clearing a little away from the creek and pitched my tent. The air was still, and I could hear the creek faintly in the background. I cooked a simple meal on my stove and ate slowly, watching the light fade through the trees. That first night was quiet. I lay in my tent, listening to the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. I felt safe, wrapped in my sleeping bag, tired from the long day. Sleep came quickly. The next morning, I packed up and moved deeper into the valley. The trail was faint here, overgrown and sometimes lost entirely under fallen debris. I had to rely on the map often, checking landmarks and making sure I stayed on track. The forest seemed thicker, darker. The air felt damp and heavy. Around midday, the trail climbed again, winding along the side of the valley toward the next ridge. I was sweating, my clothes sticking to me. The pack felt heavier and my steps slowed. At one point, I slipped on loose dirt and caught myself on a root. My heart raced, and I stood still for a while, breathing hard. When I finally reached the top of the ridge, I realized how far I had gone. The view was breathtaking but also isolating. I couldn't see any sign of people, no roads, no houses, no smoke, just endless forest. I pressed on, following the trail along the ridge until it started to descend again. It was late afternoon when I realized I had misjudged my pace. I wasn't anywhere near where I planned to camp for the second night. The trail was steep, rocky, and hard to follow. Shadows stretched long between the trees. I pushed myself, but by the time I reached a spot flat enough for a tent, the light was almost gone. I quickly set up camp, cooked in near darkness, and crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted. My body ached. I told myself I would catch up on distance the next day. That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint but sharp, like branches breaking. I lay still, listening. My tent was thin, and every sound outside seemed amplified. I heard movement, something large walking slowly through the brush. My pulse quickened. Could be a deer or maybe a bear. I had hung my food in a tree, far enough away, but the thought still made me uneasy. The steps moved closer, then paused. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then the sound drifted away, fading into the distance. I stayed awake for a long time after that, staring at the fabric of the tent, straining to hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. The next morning, I felt groggy and unsettled. I packed up quickly and started hiking. The trail dropped into another valley, narrower and darker than the first. The walls of the valley rose steeply, and the trail followed the river tightly. It felt closed in with little sky above. By midday, clouds gathered and rain started falling. At first, it was light, but soon it poured. The trail turned muddy, slippery. My clothes were soaked, and the water ran down my face. I pulled on my rain jacket, but it did little against the constant downpour. I trudged on, hoping to find higher ground to camp. The rain didn't stop. Hours passed, and my body felt heavy. My boots were filled with water, squishing with every step. I finally found a small flat area above the river and set up my tent in the rain. Everything was wet. My pack, my clothes, even the inside of the tent. I huddled in my damp sleeping bag, shivering. That night, I barely slept. The rain hammered on the tent, and I kept imagining the river rising, flooding the valley. At some point, I drifted off, only to wake to silence. The rain had stopped. When I stepped outside at dawn, the world was dripping and gray. The river had risen, rushing louder than before. The trail ahead was barely visible, washed out in places. I knew I had to keep moving, but the valley felt more dangerous now. The ground was unstable, slick with mud. As I continued, I noticed something unsettling. The trail markers, small painted blazes on trees, were gone in some stretches. I had to backtrack multiple times, trying to find the right path. At one point, I realized I was moving in circles, the river appearing again where it shouldn't have. Frustration set in. My legs ached, my stomach growled, and every step felt heavier than the last. By afternoon, I was completely disoriented. The valley twisted and turned, and the map didn't seem to match what I saw. The river split into smaller streams, and the terrain grew confusing. I forced myself to stay calm, retracing my steps, checking my compass. But the feeling of being lost pressed in on me. The sun began to sink, and I still hadn't found the trail. I had to camp again, this time on a damp patch of ground between trees. I cooked the last of my easy food, staring into the shadows around me. Every sound made me tense. That night, fear sat heavy in my chest. I kept thinking about how far I was from help, how no one knew exactly where I was. If I stayed lost, no one would find me quickly. The thought of being trapped in the valley, of running out of food, gnawed at me. The next day, I rose early and forced myself to climb out of the valley, away from the river. I scrambled up steep, muddy slopes, pulling myself up by roots and rocks. My hands were raw, my knees scraped. When I reached the ridge above, I collapsed on the ground, breathing hard. From there, I could see faint lines of what looked like a trail cutting across the forest below. Hope surged in me. I stumbled toward it, pushing through thick brush until I finally reached a worn path. Relief washed over me, though I didn't know yet if it was the right trail. I followed it for hours, my feet dragging. The forest thinned, and I recognized a landmark from the map, a rock formation shaped like a tower. I knew then I was back on track. My body ached with exhaustion, but I kept moving. By evening, I reached a wide section of trail that I remembered passing days earlier. I had looped back, closer to where I started. The sight of familiar ground nearly brought me to tears. That night, I set up camp one last time, but my fear had eased. I was tired, filthy, and sore. I had been planning the hiking trip for weeks. I wanted something that felt like an escape, something away from work, noise, and constant routine. The trail I chose was one I had read about in a few online forums. It wasn't one of the most popular ones, which was the reason I picked it. I wanted quiet, space, and a chance to push myself a little bit. The idea of being out there with no one around, just nature and me, sounded perfect in my head. The morning I left, the air was cool and still, the kind of stillness you notice when you step out of your car in a quiet place. The parking lot at the trailhead had only two other vehicles. One looked like it had been there a while, maybe someone camping deep into the trail, and the other was empty but fresh. I took a deep breath and looked up at the tree line. The woods stretched far and wide, a wall of green broken only by the thin dirt trail winding its way inside. I adjusted my backpack, making sure the straps were tight against my shoulders. Inside, I had everything I thought I might need: water bottles, a first aid kit, snacks, an emergency blanket, a flashlight, a multi-tool, and a map of the area. I wasn't new to hiking, but I wasn't an expert either. My biggest mistake was thinking I was better prepared than I actually was. The first part of the trail was peaceful. The dirt path crunched softly under my boots, and the trees shielded me from the sun, which was still low in the sky. Birds chirped above, unseen but heard clearly, and every so often a squirrel darted across the path. The air smelled of damp soil and pine needles, fresh and clean. It was the kind of smell you only get deep in the woods. I walked for over an hour before I realized I hadn't seen a single other person. That wasn't strange on a less popular trail, but it made me more aware of the silence that grew between bird calls and the occasional rustle of leaves. Every step took me farther from the car and the road. The trail began to climb uphill, not steep but steady, enough to slow me down and make me sweat. My breathing grew heavier, and I had to stop a few times to drink from my bottle. From higher up, I could see through the breaks in the trees. Rolling hills stretched out below me, green and endless, and in the distance, darker ridges of mountains rose sharply. It was beautiful, but it also reminded me how far away I was from everything. As I moved deeper into the trail, I noticed it narrowed. The ground became rockier, roots snaked across it, and every step required more focus. I checked the map now and then, but the trail markers were sparse, and I trusted my memory more than I should have. The woods felt thicker, the trees closer, their trunks like tall pillars blocking the sun. The air grew cooler, and I felt a shiver even though I was sweating from the climb. A couple of hours in, I sat down on a flat rock to rest. I ate some trail mix, drank more water, and tried to calm the uneasy feeling that had crept up on me. The forest seemed different now, not hostile exactly, but heavy. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was pressing. No wind, no birds, no rustle of animals. Just stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. I shook it off and kept walking. The trail turned steeper, climbing a ridge that looked smaller on the map than it felt in real life. My legs burned with each step, my lungs working harder. The path twisted sharply, and a few times I had to grab tree trunks to keep my balance. My boots slipped on loose soil, sending small rocks tumbling down the slope behind me. I kept pushing, sweat dripping into my eyes, until I finally reached the top. The ridge opened into a clearing. From here, the view was wider, but it wasn't what I had expected. The sky had changed. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, thick and heavy, covering the sun. A low rumble of thunder echoed faintly, and I realized the weather was turning. I hadn't checked the forecast as carefully as I should have. I pulled out the map again, trying to gauge how far I had gone. The markings weren't clear, and with no cell service, I couldn't double-check with GPS. I figured I was maybe 6 or 7 miles in. If the storm came, turning back right away might be smart, but I convinced myself I had time. That decision was my second mistake. I pressed forward, hoping to reach a landmark on the map before turning back. The trail sloped downward into a darker section of forest. The trees were so tall and close together that barely any light reached the ground. The dirt here was damp, soft under my boots, and the air smelled like wet leaves. My steps echoed strangely, like the sound was swallowed by the forest. Then I heard it, a sharp snap like a branch breaking under weight. It wasn't me. I had been standing still, checking my water bottle. I froze and turned my head slowly, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the sound had been close. I waited, holding my breath, but silence followed. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer, or maybe a branch falling naturally. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I walked faster. The trail wound deeper, twisting like it didn't want to be followed. I noticed fewer markers now, just faint paint on trees, faded and hard to see. At one point, I had to stop and backtrack because I had taken a wrong turn. My stomach tightened with unease. The woods here looked the same in every direction, and the path was less clear. The sound came again. Another crack, this one behind me. I turned fast, my heart pounding. Still nothing, just endless trunks and shadows. My breathing grew loud, too loud, and I forced myself to keep moving, trying not to look back again. Rain began to fall. It started as a light drizzle, then quickly grew heavier. The drops pattered on leaves above, dripping down in steady streams. The ground grew slick, mud forming under my boots. I pulled out my rain jacket, but it only helped a little. Water ran down my face, and the chill sank through my clothes. I tried to move faster, but the trail was slippery, and I almost fell twice. The storm was loud now, thunder rumbling above, lightning flashing through the canopy. The air smelled sharp, like ozone and wet earth. The forest felt alive in a different way, restless and hostile. Another sound cut through the storm. This time it wasn't just a snap, it was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, close behind me. I froze mid-step, the rain soaking through my jacket. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to turn around, but I couldn't move. The footsteps stopped when I did. Silence again, except for the storm. I forced myself to walk. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the mud made it too dangerous. My boots sank into the ground with each step, and my breathing came fast and shallow. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but all I saw were dark trees blurred by rain. The feeling of being followed grew stronger. Each time I stopped, I swore I heard faint movement behind me. Not animals, not random sounds, footsteps, timed with mine but always a second late. Panic started to take over. I pulled out my map again, my hands shaking. The rain smeared the ink, making it even harder to read. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. The trail looked unfamiliar, less like a marked path and more like worn ground from animals. I realized I was lost. The storm raged on, and the woods pressed closer. The shadows between trees seemed deeper, and the sound of water dripping, branches snapping, and thunder rolling all blurred together. I moved without thinking, just trying to get out, but every turn felt wrong. Hours passed. My legs ached, my stomach growled, and my water supply dropped. I found myself circling, recognizing the same fallen log twice. The feeling of being followed never left. Sometimes it grew so strong I spun around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was never anyone there. As the light faded and the sky darkened, fear settled deep in me. I was wet, cold, hungry, and completely lost. The woods no longer felt like a place I had chosen to visit. They felt like a trap. When night finally fell, I had no choice but to stop. My flashlight beam cut weakly through the rain, and I found a spot under a large tree to rest. I wrapped myself in the emergency blanket, shivering as water still soaked through. The sound of the storm dulled a little, but the woods never grew silent. Twigs snapped in the distance. Leaves rustled like something moved just out of sight. I barely slept. Every time my eyes closed, a noise jolted me awake. I sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to step out of the trees. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky stayed gray and heavy. My body was stiff, my throat dry, and my stomach empty. I forced myself to stand and move again. I picked a direction and walked, praying it would lead somewhere. The woods seemed endless. My map was useless now, my sense of direction broken. Hours dragged on, each step heavier. My boots rubbed blisters into my feet. I had been planning the trip for months, even though I kept telling myself it was just another hike. I liked to do long hikes alone sometimes, especially on weekends when work stress piled up. I wasn't a professional hiker or anything like that, but I knew how to handle long trails, how to pack the right gear, and how to manage myself if things got rough. The trail I chose this time was one I had read about in an old hiking book. It wasn't listed as one of the popular ones, which was exactly why it interested me. I wanted quiet. I wanted long stretches of trail without crowds, without noise, without people asking me where I was headed. The book said it wasn't an official trail anymore, just an old logging road that cut through hills and dense patches of forest. It also mentioned that it was easy to get lost if I strayed from it, but at the same time it was supposed to give some of the best views of the valley once I got to the higher ridges. That was enough for me. The morning I set out, the air was cool and the sky was clear. I parked my car at a small pull-off by the side of the road where the book said the old trail started. There was no real sign, just a narrow break in the tree line where dirt and stones formed a faded path. It felt more like a forgotten service road than a hiking trail. I strapped on my pack, made sure I had water, food, a small first aid kit, my flashlight, my folding knife, and a map that I had drawn based on the book's vague description. My phone was charged, but I knew the service would be gone soon after I got deep into the hills. The first part of the trail was calm. The trees were close together, tall pines and some oaks, and the ground was covered in needles and dry leaves. The road itself was uneven with ruts, but it was easy to follow. I moved slowly at first, just to let my legs warm up. The forest was quiet, and the only sounds were my boots pressing into the dirt and the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt good, almost too peaceful. After an hour or so, I reached the first steep section. The old logging road curved upward, and the sun started to break through the canopy. I took small sips of water and pushed on. The higher I went, the less I could hear of the road far behind me. The quietness started to feel different. It wasn't relaxing anymore. It was heavy, as if the woods were swallowing every sound I made. I kept moving. The book had said that the trail stretched about 10 miles before ending at a clearing with a wide view of the valley. That was my goal. 10 miles in, 10 miles out. Hard, but doable in one long day if I started early, which I had. By late morning, the trail narrowed. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, and in some places I had to step over rotting logs. There were no markers, but I knew I was still on track because the faint outline of the road was there, packed dirt beneath layers of leaves. Every now and then, I would stop and look back just to see how far I had come. The forest looked the same in every direction. That sameness started to worry me. I told myself it was fine. I had been in plenty of woods before where everything blended together. That was normal, but something about this place made it worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I lost sight of the trail even for a few minutes, I would never find it again. Around noon, I stopped to eat a snack on a fallen log. I drank more water and looked around. The trees here were thicker, and there was less light reaching the ground. I noticed how still the air was. No breeze, no movement of leaves, not even the distant call of a bird. It felt unnatural, like the woods were holding their breath. I didn't want to stay still for long, so I packed up and pushed forward. The road dipped down into a hollow, damp and filled with moss. I stepped carefully because the ground was soft. At the bottom, I saw the remains of what looked like an old wooden structure, maybe part of the logging operation that used to be here. Just a few beams rotting in the dirt, half buried. I kept going, but from that point on I started to feel uneasy. Every sound I made seemed too loud, and every silence after felt too long. I noticed how often I looked behind me, as if expecting to see someone there. Of course, there never was. The road was empty. By mid-afternoon, I reached a steep ridge where the trail zigzagged upward again. My legs were tired, and sweat soaked through my shirt, but I didn't want to stop. Something in me wanted to be done with this place as fast as possible. I climbed, step by step, until I finally came out onto a higher section where the trees thinned and I could see out over the valley. The view was everything the book had promised. A wide stretch of forest and hills rolled out in front of me, with a river winding far below. For a moment, I felt calm again. The sun was still high, the air was clear, and from up there I could almost forget how strange the forest had felt below. But then I noticed the shadows. They were long, stretched out across the clearing in front of me, even though it was still early. I checked the time. I had more than enough daylight left to head back, but the shadows made it look like evening was coming fast. I ate a little more food, drank the last of my first bottle of water, and turned to start the hike back. The trail behind me seemed darker now. I reminded myself it was just the change of angle with the sun. Still, I tightened the straps on my pack and walked faster. The way down felt different. The same places I had passed earlier didn't look the same anymore. The hollow with the rotting beams looked darker, wetter, and I swore the wood had shifted even though I knew that was impossible. The air was cooler, and I could hear faint creaks, like trees bending, even though there was no wind. At one point, I stopped dead in my tracks. I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. They were faint, matching mine. When I stopped, they stopped. I stood still for a long time, heart pounding, listening. Nothing, just silence. Finally, I forced myself to keep moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I picked up my pace, but the faster I walked, the more careless I became. I tripped on a root, caught myself on my hands, and scraped my palm. I cursed under my breath, wiped the dirt off, and kept going. My nerves were stretched thin now. Every noise made me twitch. Every shadow looked like something crouching by the trail. By the time the sun was sinking lower, I realized I wasn't making the progress I should have. The trail looked different, less like a road and more like a narrow deer path. I stopped and checked my map, but it was useless. The map wasn't detailed enough, just a rough sketch. That was when the fear really set in. I had wandered off the old road without realizing it. The forest around me was thicker, and the ground was uneven. I turned back to retrace my steps, but after 10 minutes, I couldn't find the wide shape of the old road anymore. Panic rose in my chest. I forced myself to breathe slowly. I still had time, I told myself. I still had daylight. I needed to pick a direction and keep steady until I found the trail again. But every direction looked the same. Trees, underbrush, uneven ground. I moved carefully, marking trees with small cuts from my knife to avoid going in circles. The forest grew darker, and the light turned orange. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop now. An hour later, the sun dropped behind the ridge, and shadows swallowed everything. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but it also made the forest feel tighter. My breathing was loud in my ears. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I found a spot against a tree, sat down, and tried to stay calm. Every crack of a branch made me jump. My flashlight beam swept across the trees again and again. My water was running low, and I rationed what little food I had left. I thought about walking in the dark, but the ground was too dangerous. One wrong step and I could twist an ankle or worse. So I waited, staring into the dark woods, praying for morning. When the sun finally came up, weak light spilling between the trees, I stood on shaky legs and started moving again. I tried to head downhill, figuring it would lead me toward a road or the river I had seen from the ridge. But the forest kept twisting me around. Hours passed. My throat was dry, my legs weak. I stumbled more than once. I saw animal tracks in the mud and heard rustling in the brush, but I never saw anything clear. The fear of being watched never left me. By the second night, exhaustion hit hard. I had barely eaten, barely slept. My flashlight was dimming, and I knew the batteries wouldn't last. I huddled against another tree, shivering, even though the air wasn't cold. On the third day, I heard something that gave me hope, the faint rush of water. I forced myself to follow the sound, tripping and sliding down a steep slope until I reached a narrow stream. I dropped to my knees and drank greedily, ignoring the dirt in the water. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me somewhere. My body ached. My feet were blistered, but I pushed on. By late afternoon, I stumbled out of the trees and onto a gravel road. Relief washed over me so strong I nearly collapsed. A mile down the road, I saw a small cabin. It was old but still standing. Nobody was there, but behind it was